Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back into a strange and secret world, a time when brilliant minds raced against a ticking clock, and in the middle of it all was a desert so quiet you could hear the wind whisper across the sand. This is the story of the Manhattan Project, the top secret mission that changed the world forever. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. I always love to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's story together. The desert stretches out before us, vast, dry and silent, a place where the heat seems to settle in your bones, where the wind carries whispers that vanish as quickly as they come. But under that stillness, a storm is building. It's 1942. The world is at war, and in secret corners of America, a group of scientists are working on a project so secret, so monumental, that most of the people involved don't even know what they're building. They called it the Manhattan Project. Now, the name might sound like something you'd see on a fancy office door in New York City, and actually it kind of was. The project started under the Manhattan Engineer District based in New York. That's the quirky part. It had nothing to do with the desert, or the bomb itself. Just a bureaucratic label that stuck. But what they were building, that was no ordinary invention. Imagine being a scientist who spent years studying the mysteries of the atom, and suddenly you're handed a top secret assignment and told, we need to split atoms. Fast. No pressure, right? Historians still argue whether the scientists fully understood the scale of what they were about to unleash, or whether they were just swept up in the rush of discovery. Either way, they got to work. Factories popped up across the country, in places like Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, and Los Alamos, New Mexico. Each site had its own job. One might enrich uranium, another might produce plutonium, and then, in a quiet corner of the New Mexico desert, they'd assemble it all together. Thousands of people worked on the project, engineers, mathematicians, chemists, glassblowers, even cooks, and most of them had no idea what they were really helping to build. Some thought they were working on a new kind of engine, or a special airplane part. There was even a running joke in one factory that they were making a super refrigerator for the army. And you know, in a way, that wasn't too far off, except this fridge wasn't going to keep your leftovers fresh. The secrecy was intense. Workers were told to follow instructions, ask no questions, and above all, keep their mouths shut. There were guards, censors, and strict rules about who could go where. People lived in fenced-off towns with their mail checked, their calls monitored, even their shopping lists might be reviewed. It was like a small, strange world, hidden inside the larger one, and while the scientists in their white lab coats scribbled equations on chalkboards, there was one figure at the centre of it all, J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was a complicated guy, brilliant, intense, a little moody, and the kind of person who could quote Sanskrit poetry one moment and debate nuclear physics the next. People called him Oppie, and he was the scientific director of the Manhattan Project. He once said, after watching the first atomic explosion, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. But that moment, the first test, that was still far off. For now, the desert lay quiet, waiting. Miles of empty land, stretching into the horizon, baking in the sun, a perfect place for a secret so dangerous it couldn't be hidden anywhere else. And as the days turned to weeks, the storm kept building. A storm that would soon light up the sky and change the world forever. The secret cities. They didn't appear on maps. They didn't get road signs. And for the most part, the people living nearby didn't even know they were there. Imagine driving through the countryside, past farms and fields, and suddenly there's a checkpoint, a fence, and a little sign that just says, US government property, keep out. If you asked what was going on inside, the guards might just smile politely or stare back in silence, letting the unspoken message hang in the air. One of these hidden towns was Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Before the Manhattan Project, it was just rolling hills and farmland, a quiet, peaceful place. Then, almost overnight, bulldozers arrived, trucks roared in, roads were paved, fences were built, and the sleepy fields were transformed into a bustling city. At its peak, over 75,000 people lived and worked in Oak Ridge, crammed into hastily built barracks, dormitories, and prefab homes. It was the kind of place where you might wake up to the sound of hammering, peek out your window, and see a new building going up right across the street. People joked that the town grew so fast, you could go to bed on Monday, and by Friday, there'd be an entire neighbourhood where there was just grass before. But the thing about Oak Ridge was that no one really knew what they were building. They had jobs, sure, measuring chemicals and monitoring gauges, keeping machines running. But the big picture, that was kept locked away in the offices of top scientists, the people who had clearance. The rest of the workers were given a simple message: do your job, don't ask questions, and trust that it's all for the war effort. Historians still argue whether this level of secrecy was really necessary, or if it just fed paranoia and fear. But, for better or worse, it worked. The same pattern played out in other places too. Los Alamos, out in the New Mexico desert, was perhaps the most famous of the secret cities. Imagine being a scientist. One day working in a university lab, the next you're handed a train ticket. No destination listed, just orders to report to a place you've never heard of. You arrive, and suddenly you're in a fenced-off town in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by guards with rifles, and you're told you'll be living and working here for who knows how long. Los Alamos was small, just a few hundred buildings scattered across a dusty plateau. It had houses, a school, even a movie theatre. Kids played in the dirt streets, families grew gardens, and at night you might hear music drifting from someone's porch. But it wasn't exactly normal life. The mail was censored, the phone lines were tapped, and if you left town, you had to explain exactly where you were going and why. Even inside the lab, secrecy was everywhere. Scientists were divided into teams, each working on a tiny piece of the puzzle, and only a few at the very top knew how it all fit together. There's a quirky story about how some workers thought they were building parts for a giant electric motor, while others assumed they were working on medical equipment. Nobody guessed they were helping build the most powerful weapon in human history. And in the middle of all this were the scientists themselves. Brilliant, stressed, driven. Some had left Europe to escape the Nazis. Others were rising stars in American universities. All of them now crammed into small offices and makeshift labs, scribbling equations on chalkboards, muttering about neutrons and isotopes, arguing over the right way to machine a critical piece of metal. One scientist once joked that they should put up a sign outside the lab that read, "Caution, genius at work. Also, sometimes mild panic." Because let's be honest, there were a lot of late nights, a lot of half-finished ideas, and more than a few moments where people quietly wondered, are we really doing the right thing here? The desert air carried the smell of dust and heat, the hum of generators, and the quiet clatter of tools. And all the while, the clock was ticking. The race wasn't just to build a bomb, it was to build it before the Nazis could. That pressure hung over everything, a weight that seeped into every conversation, every blueprint, every experiment. The world outside didn't know it yet, but inside these secret cities, the future was taking shape, and it was about to explode into the open, in the most literal sense possible. Inside those secret cities, behind the fences and the guards, was a strange collection of minds. The Manhattan Project had gathered some of the most brilliant scientists in the world, but it wasn't exactly a neat, orderly group of perfect thinkers. There were the quiet geniuses, the ones who could stare at a chalkboard for hours lost in equations, and the eccentrics, like the guy who insisted on working barefoot, or the one who brewed his own beer in the lab. There was Edward Teller, who would later be called the father of the hydrogen bomb, known for his intense eyes and even more intense opinions. And there was Enrico Fermi, the quiet, precise Italian physicist who once famously built a nuclear reactor in a squash court underneath the University of Chicago football stadium. Fermi had this uncanny ability to estimate things by hand, like how far a bomb blast might travel, just by looking at it and scribbling a few numbers on a napkin. People joked that if you gave Fermi a pencil and a sandwich, he could solve just about any problem. But there was also the stress, the long hours, the isolation. Scientists worked in windowless rooms, sometimes for days at a time, emerging bleary-eyed, muttering about chain reactions and critical mass. They worried about the math, about the theory, but also about whether the bomb would work at all. Because here's the thing, they were making this up as they went. No one had ever built an atomic bomb before. They were trying to figure out how much uranium or plutonium you needed, how to shape it, how to make the pieces slam together at exactly the right moment, how to avoid it accidentally going off too soon, or worse, not going off at all. Historians still argue whether Oppenheimer's team was the best choice for the job, or whether the project was rushed too fast, leaving too many details to chance. But they didn't have time to argue. The Nazis were working on their own atomic program, and every day that ticked by felt like a race against disaster. The scientists knew they were playing with forces they barely understood. Some joked about it, nervously, in late-night conversations. One story goes that when they finally calculated the critical mass of plutonium, someone muttered, "Huh, that's smaller than a grapefruit. Neat." Another physicist quietly asked, "Wait, are we sure this won't ignite the atmosphere and destroy the entire planet?" That wasn't exactly a confidence booster. And the math? It was tricky. Even the smallest errors could lead to disaster. If they got the timing wrong by even a fraction of a second, the bomb wouldn't detonate. Or worse, it could fizzle out in a catastrophic failure. They built test devices, small models, and they ran simulations. Well, simulations back then meant a lot of paper, a lot of chalk dust, and a lot of very tired physicists hunched over their desks. No supercomputers, no instant feedback, just minds, pencils, and the occasional coffee cup stain on the calculations. Still, little by little, they figured it out. The bomb would need to bring two pieces of radioactive material together at a precise moment, so quickly that they'd overcome the natural repulsion between atoms. And then, boom! The explosion would release more energy than anyone had ever seen. And the bomb, it wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol, a promise, a warning, a terrifying new chapter in the story of humanity. Outside the labs, the desert wind kept blowing, the days kept getting hotter, and the project crept closer to the moment when theory would meet reality. And the question lingered. Would the bomb work? Or would all this effort, all these sleepless nights, just go up in smoke? To understand what they were trying to do, we have to get into the strange, almost magical world of atomic physics. Now, don't worry. I'll keep it simple. At the heart of it all was the atom. Every atom has a nucleus, packed tight with protons and neutrons. And in certain atoms, like uranium-235 or plutonium-239, that nucleus is just unstable enough that if you hit it hard enough, with just the right amount of energy, it splits apart, and that's called fission, and when it splits, it throws off a few extra neutrons, and a whole lot of energy. Those extra neutrons can then slam into other atoms, splitting them, releasing even more energy, and even more neutrons, and on it goes, in a chain reaction, until, in the blink of an eye, you get a massive release of energy. A single fission reaction releases only a tiny amount of energy, but if you get enough of those reactions happening at once, that's when you get an explosion. That's the core idea behind an atomic bomb, but there's a catch. You need to have enough fissile material, packed tightly enough, to sustain the chain reaction. That amount is called the critical mass. Too little, and the reaction fizzles out. Too much, and, well, let's just say it becomes dangerous very quickly. Historians still argue about how close the Manhattan Project came to an accidental criticality accident, a sudden, unexpected chain reaction. In fact, there were a few terrifying close calls. One story goes that a scientist accidentally placed two pieces of fissile material a little too close together, and for a split second, the instruments in the room went wild. The scientist, realizing what he'd done, calmly reached in and pulled the pieces apart by hand. Everyone in the room held their breath, and then it was over. No explosion, just a narrow escape. They called those moments tickling the dragon's tail, which, honestly, is a wild way to describe nearly setting off an uncontrolled nuclear reaction. But that's how this project was. A mix of cutting-edge science, sheer nerve, and sometimes a little bit of luck. The bomb itself wasn't just one design either. They had two different approaches. One was the little boy design, which used uranium-235. It was relatively simple, a gun-type assembly, where one piece of uranium would be fired into another at high speed, like a bullet. The other was Fat Man, a more complex design using plutonium-239. It required a sphere of plutonium to be squeezed by a series of explosive lenses, all detonating at exactly the right time to create a perfect symmetrical implosion. That part, the implosion, was tricky. You needed perfect timing, down to microseconds. Get it wrong, and the bomb wouldn't work. Or worse, it might detonate prematurely. So they built test models, and more test models, trying to get the timing just right. They even invented a whole new kind of explosive detonator, just to make sure all the charges would go off in perfect sync. Imagine trying to coordinate 30 separate explosions, all happening at the exact same moment. And remember, they were doing this in the 1940s, with no computers, no fancy sensors, just slide rules, chalkboards, and a lot of brain power. It's no wonder some of the scientists joked that the real miracle wasn't that the bomb worked, but that it didn't accidentally blow them all up during testing. And yet, little by little, they got closer. The calculations, the designs, the prototypes. The pieces were starting to come together, and out there, in the desert, under the hot sun, the first test was getting closer, closer to the moment when theory would become terrifying reality. It all really started with a letter, a single piece of paper, sent across the ocean that set everything in motion. In 1939, just before the world fully plunged into war, a German-born physicist named Leo Szilard had an idea that kept him up at night. He was worried that Germany might be working on a bomb using uranium, a bomb that could unleash unimaginable destruction. Szilard knew he had to warn someone, but who? He decided it had to be the President of the United States. But he wasn't exactly on a first-name basis with Franklin D. Roosevelt, so Szilard turned to someone who was Albert Einstein. Yes, that Albert Einstein, the man whose name we associate with genius, with E equals MC squared, with that wild hair and those deep, thoughtful eyes. Einstein and Szilard had worked together before, and Einstein had the kind of clout that might make someone in Washington listen. So, they drafted a letter. It was short, just a few paragraphs, but it carried an enormous weight. It warned that uranium could be used to build a bomb, that the Germans might be ahead in this research, and that the US should act quickly to catch up. Einstein signed it, Szilard sent it, and soon it landed on President Roosevelt's desk. Roosevelt read it, leaned back in his chair, and according to the story said simply, "This requires action," and just like that, the fuse was lit. It's one of those odd moments in history where a simple letter, a few lines on a piece of paper, ended up setting the world on a course toward the atomic age. Historians still argue how much Einstein really knew about the bomb's potential, or whether he fully grasped what his letter might lead to. Einstein himself later said he regretted signing it. He wasn't involved in the Manhattan Project, never worked directly on the bomb, but that letter, it was the spark. From there, the project grew, quietly at first, tucked away in government memos and classified files. But soon, it ballooned into the massive effort we now know as the Manhattan Project. And just think, if that letter had never been sent, or if it had been ignored, would the atomic bomb have been built at all? Or would history have taken a very different path? Meanwhile, back in those secret labs and desert towns, the scientists were grinding away. Designing the bomb wasn't just about splitting atoms, it was also about engineering. They had to figure out how to build the bomb's casing, how to store the radioactive material safely, how to transport it without setting off a chain reaction by accident. Imagine driving a truck full of plutonium down a bumpy road, knowing that if you make the wrong turn, well, Let's just say it wouldn't be a fender bender. They had to design the wiring, the circuits, the timing mechanisms. Even the shape of the bomb's core was a matter of heated debate. Some scientists argued for a spherical shape. Others thought a flattened lens would work better. There were models built from wood, from clay, even from silver. It was a strange blend of theoretical physics and hands-on craftsmanship, like building a very, very dangerous piece of IKEA furniture, except the instructions were written in advanced calculus, and if you got it wrong, it wouldn't be a wobbly bookshelf. It would be a catastrophic failure, little by little. The bomb was taking shape, and out in the desert, the winds kept blowing, the sand kept shifting. The world had no idea what was coming, of course. All of this came with a price tag, a huge one. The Manhattan Project wasn't just a scientific experiment, it was one of the most expensive endeavours in human history. By the time it was all said and done, the project had cost the US government over $2 billion. That's in 1940s money. If you adjust for inflation, that's somewhere around $30 billion today. Yeah, 30 billion. Let that sink in for a second. You could buy a lot of snacks with that. But the scale of the Manhattan Project was so massive, it kind of makes sense. They were building entire cities, like Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, Hanford. Not just a few buildings here and there, whole communities, complete with roads, schools, hospitals, or grocery stores, even movie theatres. And inside those towns, thousands of workers needed housing, food, transportation. Plus you had the materials. Uranium and plutonium aren't exactly sold at the corner store, and refining them required enormous industrial complexes. At Oak Ridge, they built gigantic machines called calutrons. They looked like giant circular racetracks, except they weren't built for horses. They were built for speeding ions of uranium through magnetic fields, separating the rare uranium-235 from the much more common uranium-238. It was mind-boggling. And at Hanford, they built the first large-scale plutonium production reactors. These things were massive. Imagine huge buildings, the size of football fields, filled with heavy water, fuel rods, and enough radioactive material to make your hair stand on end. And here's the kicker. Most of this was done in total secrecy. The people working on the project didn't know the full picture. To them, it was just a job. They knew they were working on something important, but the details? That was for the higher-ups. Historians still argue whether the secrecy slowed down progress, or whether it actually helped keep the project on track. But either way, it was a lot of money and a lot of effort, all for a single goal, to build a bomb before the Nazis could. And then there were the human costs. Tens of thousands of people worked grueling hours, often in dangerous conditions, exposed to radiation and hazardous chemicals. There were accidents, contaminated clothing, even cases where workers got radiation burns from handling radioactive material without proper protection. But safety standards were, let's say, not exactly a top priority in those days. One worker reportedly joked, "Well, if the radiation doesn't get me, the stress will." And then there were the small, strange details, like how they used silver instead of copper for the calutrons at Oak Ridge, because copper was scarce during the war. So the US Treasury loaned out thousands of tons of silver, literally from the national reserves, to build these machines. It's almost funny. Imagining government scientists nervously explaining to the Treasury, "Hey, we need to borrow your silver to build a thing. We can't really tell you what it is, but it's important." The Treasury agreed, and when the war was over, they actually returned the silver. Most of it anyway. Some of it had, well, mysteriously disappeared during the process. Funny how that happens. So the money poured in, the materials stacked up, and out in the desert, the storm kept brewing. The bomb was coming together piece by piece, and the world had no idea what was about to happen. But there was another side to the Manhattan Project, one that most people didn't know about at the time, and wouldn't find out until much later. The spies. Yep. Even in the middle of a top-secret American project, the Soviets had managed to slip inside. While scientists were racing to figure out fission and critical mass, Soviet agents were quietly gathering intel, piece by piece, and shipping it off to Moscow. One of the most famous of these spies was Klaus Fuchs. Fuchs was a brilliant German-born physicist who had fled Nazi Germany and ended up working at Los Alamos. He was quiet, polite, incredibly smart. And all the while, he was copying top-secret documents and passing them on to Soviet contacts. Historians still argue how much damage Fuchs did, but there's no doubt his espionage helped the Soviet Union develop its own atomic bomb much faster than it would have otherwise. Fuchs wasn't the only one. There were others, like David Greenglass, a machinist at Los Alamos, and the infamous Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. It's kind of wild. While America was pouring billions into building the bomb, right under their noses, information was leaking out through back channels. And it wasn't just high-level secrets, sometimes it was little things. A careless conversation, a misplaced file. Even a photograph left lying around could reveal critical details. There's a quirky story about how a janitor at Los Alamos once overheard a conversation between two physicists, and later he was questioned by security because he had mentioned the word plutonium in a letter to his cousin. That's how tightly guarded this project was. Even the word plutonium could set off alarms. The Soviets weren't the only ones interested, though. Other countries were trying to figure out what was going on too, but the Manhattan Project had built a wall of secrecy so thick it was almost impossible for outsiders to penetrate. Inside, the pressure was relentless. The scientists were burning out, working long hours, under constant stress. Oppenheimer himself was starting to look thinner, more tired, haunted, some said, by the weight of what they were building. The meetings got tenser, debates grew sharper, and tempers sometimes flared. One physicist joked that they needed a separate chalkboard just for arguments, because the regular boards were getting filled up with angry equations. But despite the stress, the leaks, the debates, the project pressed on. Because there was no turning back now. Too much had been invested, too many resources committed. The bomb was coming. And as the work continued, the scientists were about to create something no one on Earth had ever seen before. Something that would change everything. The winds in the desert kept blowing, and somewhere, in a quiet corner of Los Alamos, a blueprint, a formula, a few simple numbers on a chalkboard, were about to unlock the power of the universe. Los Alamos, that little speck of a town in the New Mexico desert, was like no place on Earth. Imagine a community built in the middle of nowhere, where scientists walked to work past barbed wire fences, where soldiers patrolled the streets, and every letter you sent home was opened and read before it left. It was a strange mix of the ordinary and the extraordinary. On one hand, it was a town like any other. There were kids riding bikes, families planting small gardens, dances at the community centre on Saturday nights. But on the other hand, there were physicists scribbling equations about nuclear fission on the backs of envelopes. There were guards stationed at every gate, and there were whispered conversations about the gadget. That's what they called it. Not the bomb, not the atomic weapon, just the gadget. Kind of a strange understatement for something that could flatten a city, but maybe that's how they coped. Give it a nickname. Make it feel smaller than it really was. Historians still argue whether the people at Los Alamos fully grasped the scale of what they were doing, or whether they were just too caught up in the moment. Maybe it was a little of both. Oppenheimer once described the atmosphere there as a brilliant intensity, a sense of high purpose, and a deep unease. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing you're about to jump, but not knowing if the parachute will open. Life at Los Alamos had its quirks too. Scientists might work 12-hour shifts, then unwind with a game of chess or a movie in the makeshift theatre. There were pick-up baseball games, barbecues, even poker nights. And yet, everyone knew, in the back of their minds, that they were building something that could end millions of lives. It was a strange kind of normal, a quiet hum of life, mixed with the constant low-grade anxiety of knowing you were working on something that might change the world forever. One physicist joked that they should hang a sign over the entrance that read, "Welcome to Los Alamos, where the impossible becomes possible, and we're all just a little too sleep-deprived to notice." There was also the isolation. Los Alamos was surrounded by rugged mountains. The scientists and their families were cut off from the outside world. Mail was censored, phone calls were monitored. If you wanted to leave, you needed a pass. It was like living in a fishbowl, where everyone could see you, but no one outside knew what you were really doing. And yet, despite the secrecy, ideas flowed like water. There were blackboards in the dining halls, chalk at the ready. Physicists would scribble equations in between bites of their mashed potatoes. Engineers would sketch out bomb designs on napkins during coffee breaks. It was a place where inspiration could strike at any moment, even if you were just waiting in line at the commissary. But there was also the pressure. The Nazis were still a threat, and though they didn't know it at the time, the clock was ticking. Every day they worked, every test they ran, every equation they solved, it was all leading toward a single terrifying moment. The moment when they'd take that gadget, that strange, deadly device, out to the desert and see if it actually worked. The question wasn't if they'd try it, it was when, and what would happen when they finally pressed the button. The Trinity test, that's what they called it. Trinity. It almost sounds poetic, doesn't it? But there was nothing gentle about what was about to happen. Out in the New Mexico desert, at a place called the Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of the Dead Man, a team of scientists, engineers and soldiers were preparing for the world's first atomic explosion. It was July 1945. The desert air was thick with heat, the sand hot enough to burn your boots. And there, rising from the dusty earth, was a strange-looking tower, narrow, fragile, with a bomb perched at the top. The gadget, it didn't look like much, just a metallic sphere, wires dangling from its surface, almost like a bizarre art project that had gotten out of hand. But inside was enough plutonium to unleash an energy no one had ever seen before. Oppenheimer was there, pacing nervously. The scientists were there, some biting their nails, others standing back with a strange detached calm, and the soldiers, well, they were just doing their jobs, not fully understanding that they were about to witness the birth of the atomic age. The hours ticked by, final checks were made, cables were connected, detonators were armed. It was almost time. But there was a problem. The weather. Storm clouds gathered, lightning flashed in the distance, and for a while, they weren't sure if they'd have to postpone the test. Can you imagine? Standing out in the desert, waiting to set off the most powerful bomb ever built, and worrying about a little rain. Historians still argue whether the delay actually helped, giving the team a little more time to check the wiring, double-check the circuits, or whether it just made everyone's nerves a little more frayed. Either way, at 5:29 a.m. on July 16th, 1945, the countdown began. 10, 9, 8. The scientists huddled in bunkers, shielding their eyes behind darkened goggles. Some lay face down in the sand, covering their heads. Others stood, holding their breath. 5, 4, 3, and then a light, brighter than anything they'd ever seen. The sky, lit up like the surface of the sun. The heat, a sudden searing wave, felt miles away. The shock wave, a deep rolling boom that shook the earth, rattled windows, and sent a hot wind roaring across the plain. People miles from the site saw the flash. Cattle were knocked off their feet, and those watching, they knew the world had just changed forever. One scientist turned to Oppenheimer and said, "The war is over." But Oppenheimer, he just stood there, silent, watching the mushroom cloud rise into the sky, and in a whisper, he quoted the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The Trinity test was a success, if you could call it that. The bomb worked, the science was sound, but what they had created was terrifying beyond words. And now, the question was, what would they do with it? And so, just a few weeks after the Trinity test lit up the desert sky, the bomb was loaded onto a ship. Destination: Hiroshima. The city of Hiroshima was a bustling port, a hub of factories, homes, schools. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the people of Hiroshima woke up like it was any other day. Children getting ready for school, workers heading to the factories, mothers sweeping the front steps. They had no idea that 31,000 feet above them, a B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay was approaching. and inside its bay, a single bomb. Little Boy, that's what they called it. A strange nickname for a weapon that could level an entire city. At 8:15 a.m, the bomb was dropped. It fell silently through the air, spinning, glinting in the sunlight, and then a flash, a sudden blinding light, and an explosion so powerful it flattened everything within a mile of the blast. Buildings turned to rubble, glass shattered, fires erupted, and in an instant, tens of thousands of lives were gone. The shockwave rippled outward. People miles away were knocked off their feet, and those who survived, they would never forget what they saw. Historians still argue whether the bomb was necessary to end the war, or whether Japan would have surrendered without it. The debate continues, even to this day. 3 days later, it happened again, this time in Nagasaki. A second bomb, Fat Man, dropped on a city nestled between hills, a city that had already been targeted by air raids, and in an instant, it was gone. Another flash, another firestorm, another city reduced to ashes. The world had entered the atomic age. Back in America, news of the bombings was met with a strange mix of emotions. Relief that the war might finally end, celebration that the bomb had worked, and yet a quiet, creeping unease. Because now, the secret was out. The world knew what America had built, and it wasn't long before other nations started building their own bombs. The arms race had begun, but for the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were no celebrations, only rubble, ash, and an overwhelming sense of loss. The air, still crackling with invisible radiation. The survivors, walking in a daze through the ruins of their city. Children crying for their parents. Fires smouldering in the distance, and the haunting, eerie silence that follows an explosion so powerful it changes the course of history. The bombs had worked. The war was ending. But the world would never be the same. When the dust settled, the official story was simple. The bombs had ended the war. Japan surrendered on August 15th, 1945, just 9 days after Hiroshima and 6 days after Nagasaki. The headlines declared victory. The images showed cheering crowds in Times Square, and for many the bombs were seen as a necessary evil. They had saved lives, the logic went, by forcing a surrender without a costly invasion of Japan. But even back then, it wasn't so simple. Historians still argue whether the bombs were truly what ended the war, or whether Japan was already on the brink of surrender. Some point to the Soviet Union's sudden entry into the war against Japan as an even bigger factor. After all, the Soviets declared war on Japan on August the 8th, right in between the two bombings. Did the shock of a two-front war push Japan to give up, or was it the sheer devastation of the atomic bombs? The truth might be somewhere in between. And then there's the moral debate. Even some of the scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project wondered if they had gone too far. A few months after the bombings, a group of physicists wrote the Frank Report, warning that using atomic bombs on cities would set a dangerous precedent and might make future wars even more destructive. They suggested a demonstration test instead, maybe on an uninhabited island, to show the power of the bomb without killing civilians. But their warnings were ignored. It's one of those questions that still haunts history. Was there another way? Could the war have ended without Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Or was the atomic bomb the only option? No one can say for sure. What we do know is that the bombings left scars that would never fully heal. In Hiroshima, a strange eerie light filled the sky for a moment, followed by a heat so intense that it turned people to shadows on the walls. Survivors, known as hibakusha, told stories of wandering through ruined streets, their skin peeling, their eyes searching for family members who were simply gone. And long after the fires burned out, the radiation lingered. Some survivors developed cancers and other illnesses years later, the hidden price of the bombs. Meanwhile, back in America, the scientists watched from a distance. Oppenheimer, the so-called father of the bomb, met with President Truman in October 1945. The story goes that Oppenheimer told Truman he felt he had blood on his hands. Truman, reportedly annoyed, later told his staff that he never wanted to see Oppenheimer again. It was an awkward moment. Two men, both part of a world-changing decision, now facing the reality of what they'd done. For many of the scientists, the excitement of discovery, the thrill of solving impossible problems, had been replaced by a deep, uneasy feeling. They had built the bomb, it had worked, and now the question was, what next? Because once you build a bomb, you can't unbuild it. And so, even as the world celebrated the end of the war, a new kind of fear began to creep in. A fear that this was just the beginning, that the atomic bomb wasn't the end of war, but the start of something even more dangerous. Radiation, the invisible legacy of the atomic bomb, long after the flash faded, long after the fires were extinguished, there was still something in the air, something you couldn't see, couldn't smell, but that could change your body forever. For the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the aftermath wasn't just about rebuilding homes or burying the dead. It was about the strange lingering effects they couldn't explain. People developed burns that wouldn't heal, hair falling out in clumps, mysterious fevers, weakness that crept into their bones. Doctors started noticing patterns, leukemia in children, unusual cancers, immune systems breaking down. At first, they didn't have a word for it. They just knew something was wrong. And it wasn't just the survivors. The land itself had changed. Grass grew back, but slowly. Trees sprouted twisted branches, and animals in the area started showing strange deformities. The radiation had seeped into the soil, into the water, into the bodies of those who'd been exposed. Historians still argue how much the American government knew about radiation sickness at the time. Was it an unfortunate surprise, or something they expected but didn't warn people about? The truth is, it's hard to say. What we do know is that in the rush to end the war, there wasn't much time, or perhaps much interest, in studying the long-term effects of the bomb. It wasn't until years later that researchers began to understand just how devastating radiation exposure could be. And yet, even with this knowledge, the atomic age was just getting started. The bomb wasn't just a weapon, it became a blueprint for the future. Nuclear power, nuclear medicine, nuclear submarines, nuclear everything. The idea that you could harness the atom, split it open and use its energy, became a symbol of modern progress. But at what cost? That question hung over every new reactor, every lab experiment, every nuclear test. Because radiation doesn't care about borders, or treaties, or intentions. It just spreads, like an invisible echo, a shadow that lingers long after the flash. There's a strange, quiet irony here. The very thing that could destroy cities was also being used to save lives. Scientists learned that the same radioactive isotopes could be used in medicine, to target cancer cells, to image the inside of the body. The same forces that could flatten buildings were now helping doctors save patients. But the fear, it never really went away, because once you unleash the power of the atom, you can't ever truly put it back in the box. And while the world moved on, building bombs, testing weapons, setting off nuclear blasts in the ocean and the desert, the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki lived with the consequences. For them, the atomic age wasn't a theory, or a headline, or a scientific achievement. It was personal. It was the scars on their skin, the empty chairs at the dinner table, the quiet knowledge that their lives had been changed forever. The bomb's legacy didn't stop at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It rippled out across the world, changing science, politics, and the way we thought about power itself. The Manhattan Project wasn't just about building a weapon. It was the spark that ignited a whole new era of discovery and fear. For one, the same technology that split the atom for destruction was quickly adapted for energy. Nuclear power plants began to pop up in the 1950s and 60s, promising clean, efficient electricity. The atom was no longer just a bomb, it was a battery, a symbol of progress, of modern life. But the shadow of the bomb never really left. Every new nuclear reactor, every new discovery, came with an unspoken question. What if this technology is used for war instead of peace? Historians still argue whether the Manhattan Project helped push science forward, or whether it locked us into a dangerous path we couldn't escape. Because while the bomb unlocked the secrets of the atom, It also opened the door to an arms race. The Soviet Union had been watching, and with the help of spies like Klaus Fuchs, they were able to build their own bomb much faster than anyone expected. By 1949, just 4 years after the war ended, the Soviets had tested their first atomic bomb. The nuclear club was now open for membership. Soon, Britain joined, then France, then China. Each test, each explosion, sent a message to the world. We have the power to destroy, and we might use it. It was like a dangerous game of one-upmanship, except the stakes were the future of humanity. And while the world's leaders shook hands and posed for photos, behind closed doors, they were building bigger bombs, hydrogen bombs, thermonuclear weapons, devices 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. The atomic age wasn't just about energy. It was about fear, mutually assured destruction, the balance of terror. It became part of daily life. People built fallout shelters in their backyards. Schools held duck and cover drills. Governments handed out pamphlets on how to survive a nuclear attack. Though, let's be honest, most of those tips wouldn't have helped much if the worst actually happened. And through it all, the original scientists of the Manhattan Project watched, some with pride, others with regret. They had unlocked the power of the atom, but what the world did with it, that was out of their hands. Still, there were moments of hope. Scientists who had worked on the bomb began to speak out, pushing for arms control, for treaties, for a world where nuclear weapons wouldn't be used again. But the genie was out of the bottle, and the world had to learn how to live with the consequences. By the 1950s and 60s, the nuclear arms race was in full swing. The United States and the Soviet Union stockpiled thousands of warheads, each side ready to respond with overwhelming force if the other ever dared to strike. It was a strange, terrifying balance. Mutually assured destruction, they called it. The idea that if one side launched, the other would too, and both would be destroyed. A game of chicken with nuclear weapons. Historians still debate whether this balance of terror actually kept the peace, or whether it brought the world closer to the brink of annihilation. And there were close calls. Oh, there were close calls. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when American spy planes spotted Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the US coast. For 13 tense days, the world held its breath. Diplomats scrambled, military leaders prepared for war, and in secret meetings, President Kennedy and his advisors tried to figure out how to avoid a nuclear catastrophe. Some historians say it was the closest the world has ever come to full-scale nuclear war, and it all traced back to the bomb built in the desert, the Manhattan Project's legacy. But the impact of the Manhattan Project wasn't just about fear. It also changed the way nations approached science itself. The scale of the project, the way it brought together scientists, engineers, and military leaders in a coordinated effort. It became a model for big science. Massive government-funded research projects, like the space race, or particle accelerators, or the Human Genome Project. The idea that you could pour in billions of dollars, thousands of workers, all focused on a single goal. That came straight from the Manhattan Project's playbook. And there was a strange side effect too. The bomb, in all its destructive power, also sparked a wave of public fascination. Books, movies, TV shows. The mushroom cloud became an image burned into the public's imagination. Artists painted it. Filmmakers turned it into a symbol of apocalypse. Even fashion designers used it in prints and patterns, because of course they did. That's humanity for you. We take the most terrifying things and turn them into pop culture. It's a little weird, and maybe a little sad, but also kind of inevitable. Still, beneath all the science, the politics, the cultural references, the bomb was a reminder that we had unlocked a power we barely understood, and that every decision we made from then on carried consequences beyond what we could see. The desert where the first bomb exploded, so it's still there, the Trinity site. You can visit it, you know. Twice a year they open it to the public. People come from all over to stand where the earth once shook, to see the ground still marked by that terrible light. They say the glassy greenish rock, trinitite, still sparkles in the sun, a souvenir From the day the world changed, the Manhattan Project didn't just end with a flash of light in the desert, or even with the bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Its legacy lingered, shaping how we think about war, science, and the choices we make. For the scientists who had worked on the bomb, the years after the war were complicated. Some became advocates for arms control, speaking out against the very weapons they had helped create. Others stayed in the world of nuclear research, shifting their focus to energy, medicine, or space exploration. Oppenheimer, the so-called father of the atomic bomb, became a controversial figure. He had been a hero during the war, but afterward, during the Red Scare, he came under suspicion for his past political associations. In 1954, he lost his security clearance. It was a public humiliation, a dramatic fall from grace. Historians still debate whether Oppenheimer's fall was fair, or whether it was a way to silence a man who had grown too critical of the nuclear arms race. Either way, he remained a symbol, a brilliant mind, haunted by what it had helped unleash. And then there's the question of whether it was all worth it. Did the Manhattan Project save lives by ending the war quickly? Or did it open a door that should have stayed closed? It's a question historians, philosophers and scientists still wrestle with today. Because the Manhattan Project didn't just give us the bomb, it gave us the world we live in now. A world where the threat of nuclear war, though quieter than it once was, never fully went away. A world where energy can light a city or destroy it. A world where the line between discovery and destruction is sometimes razor thin, and perhaps most of all, a world where we know, deep down, that the choices we make in science, in politics, in war, they don't just affect the present, they ripple forward, shaping generations yet to come. That's the story of the Manhattan Project, a story of brilliance and fear, of power and regret, of discovery, and the dangerous price that sometimes comes with it. So, as the dust settles, let's take a deep breath together, in and out. Let the story of the Manhattan Project, the deserts and the scientists, the light in the sky and the questions that still linger, just fade into the background. Let it drift away, like a soft breeze, across the sands of New Mexico. The choices that were made back then, they're part of a history we can't change. But here, in this quiet moment, you can simply let it all go. The names, the dates, the debates, they can wait for another day. Right now, all you need to do is rest. Feel the weight of your body sinking into the mattress, the warmth of the blankets wrapping around you, the soft hum of the night, maybe a fan whirring in the background. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift. And if a memory of the story pops back into your mind, that's okay. Just watch it float by, like a cloud. No need to hold on to it. Just let it pass, and keep sinking deeper into this soft, quiet space. Your body, calm and heavy. Your mind, quiet. The day is done. The world can wait. And for now, it's just you, the darkness, the stillness, and the slow, steady rhythm of your breath. Rest easy, my friend. Sweet dreams.